Yeah, so thanks for joining, everyone. Really pleased you could be here. We're going to start off today with a couple of details on the macro picture as it relates to data protection specifically. Then we're going to go to what I'll say the micro level and actually look at the buyers and what their changes in the market that's happening there. And then we'll look at that space in between in terms of how do we connect industry growth with other themes that are going on in our businesses as service providers, and ultimately serving our customers. So with that, we're going to have some math and break down some numbers because this, of course, is on the topic of economics. All right, so within that, wanted to start off with the industry. So the data protection as a service industry as a whole, like according to analysts, is a rising tide. So it's a $7 billion market. It's growing at almost 17% overall. The interesting call out within the analyst reports is that the backup as a service subsegment of that is growing at about 13%. Disaster recovery as a service growing almost twice that level at 23%. So if we break that down, kind of look at that within the context of the overall MSP stack, so other technologies that are being used and what the kind of related dollar values are, we can see, of course, RMM and PSA, BDR, security and cloud are the big numbers we see, but the backup and disaster recovery is an important pillar within the service offerings for managed service providers. It's a big area of spend, and that's why we thought it would be valuable to take a new fresh look at the economics of that and how that plays into our businesses. And then taking that one level lower in terms of the research that's out there, within that $11 million, there's two names that kind of stick out, we hear the most often, Veeam and Datto. So we're going to give those particular attention today, but certainly there are a long list of other names that are out there. So that's big picture on the macro. The other thing as service providers on the macro level that are the big themes today, the industry trends are, first of all, the cloud first strategy. Increasingly the conversations that we've had, and no surprise to anyone here, is that we no longer want to buy hardware. Ask the question of when's the last time you set up an Exchange server? Well, it's probably been at least a couple years, and we can see that the growth of Microsoft 365 as just a very simple but important theme in terms of that cloud first strategy. Second thing is cyber incidents. So if we look back 10 years ago, there was very little talk about cyber incidents and data protection in that same conversation. And today, the number one concern of customers, buyers, et cetera, is that threat of a cyber incident, specifically ransomware. And the frequency continues to rise. We continue to see things get more and more sophisticated. And within that, data protection being a very key element or area of focus for the bad actors to go after backup systems to take them out. So they know if they can take out the backup solution, that their likelihood of getting paid is going to improve significantly. So that awareness around cyber incidents, and specifically as it relates to data protection, is super important. So we'll touch on more on that as we go here. And then the third major trend that we hear consistently, I'm sure you can all relate in your own business, is around the IT skills shortage. So it's a challenge to hire people. It's a challenge to keep people. It's a challenge to improve people's skill sets because things are always changing. And so the more that we can address that concern and take labor out of the equation, which is of course the biggest expense within the income statement of any managed service provider, the more that you can become a more successful, more profitable business. Okay, so that's kind of big picture, macro, what's happening. Now let's take it down one level. Let's go to the micro level. Let's talk about the customers for just a brief moment so that we can link the two. So in terms of who we serve, I'd like to introduce Michael and Robert to you today. So Michael is the owner of a small accounting firm. Robert is the owner and manager of multiple dental clinics. Now, Michael is the type of individual, you've probably met him, he's reluctant to spend more money on new services. He will say, I am okay with reasonable as long as I don't have to pay more. In the grand scheme of like their technology systems, Michael would say that he doesn't really know what he doesn't know. It's just a cost of doing business. But as a service provider, when something does go wrong, he is the personality that will be unrelenting in terms of like if there's downtime, you're going to be getting calls every hour, and so you know that you need to think ahead in terms of what is needed for Michael's best interest. Now, second, I'd like to introduce Robert. Now, Robert is a slightly different character. He's a little more sophisticated in terms of how he runs his business. He understands he can't afford significant downtime, or that it would be extremely costly. He may know or have a neighbor or another business owner that he's talked to that was impacted by ransomware, and so his awareness of like the how real and personal that can be is there, and so he demands guaranteed protection, shorter RTOs, and he understands that comes with a price, which he's willing to pay. So if you remember back to earlier when we chatted about backup as a service growing at 13%, disaster recovery as a service growing at 23%, this is really where those two personas fit into that big picture research. So the growth area, there's still a big segment of customers out there that would be the cheap and cheerful Michael. They're okay with lower service levels if the price is right. It's not that you're not going to see them anymore, but increasingly the Michaels are turning into more like the persona of Robert. And that's where, they understand, their business is really their legacy. They want to get to a different level of outcomes in terms of what their data protection looks like. So shifting from never losing more than, let's say, 24 hours worth of data, which is related to doing a backup once per day, to never losing more than 1 hour of data. So an hourly backup schedule. Getting down to an RTO of 4 hours, so meaning that in the worst case scenario, there would never be more than 4 hours of downtime. Getting to longer term retention, so moving away from 15 or 30 days, sometimes we see out there, moving that to something like 90 days, adding on archive, and that can be for either compliance reasons, peace of mind, just they like that feeling of having that retention available, but also related to ransomware, is often we see that some of these ransomwares have really long dwell times, and so it can be required in incident response that you go back over 90 days in time to before the malware was found on the related systems. And the last thing I'll mention is around recovery testing. This is an area where it's the real proof of value, and in the mind of Robert, it's really about I trust you, but I want you to verify that you're truly ready. So that's our two customer personas that we've got out there. So now that we've got kind of big picture in terms of where the macro trends are headed, we know the customers we're serving and how those two link. Let's take a look at the actual economics piece. So if we look at the evolution of backup and disaster recovery, we see that there's the image-based solutions like Veeam, the integrated appliances like Datto. There's other names in there. With both of those, there's also the integrated appliance, scale-out appliances like Rubrik, Cohesity. Now, we don't tend to see them so much in the SMB space or with managed service providers. They tend to play more in the enterprise. But what all three of these have in common is that they are all a local first architecture. So they're doing very similar things. They're doing their best to leverage the cloud with that architecture. But what that means is that they are a local first solution, and they're bolting on a secondary process to move that data offsite. So cloud first, when we say cloud first architecture, it is the opposite order of operations. So it means that the data is going direct from production to offsite storage, and then in some cases, there's pieces that you may bring back to the local space for as a restore cache, but that primary copy is getting off the network. So Cove Data Protection lives under that architecture. There's other names. Druva would be another name that I'd mention in this space. And really, the question that we're going to answer today, there is whether we can this different architecture actually provides a meaningful advantage. And really, it's about two key promises. So the promise of dramatically better economics, and secondly, it's the promise of business class disaster recovery. So the question I guess we'll start with is, what does Veeam include? So we're going to take that approach. Well, for let's say roughly 10 bucks a VM or something, you're going to get the management application for your backup. But after that, you need to install it on your application server. You need to set up your local storage. That local storage will need to be, roughly 2 or probably 3 times the size of your production environment. So if you've got a terabyte of production data, you're going to need to buy about 3 terabytes of storage for your local backup. And then in addition, you're going to want to have that offsite. So you're going to have to, bolt on Cloud Connect and then have that equal amount of storage offsite. And so you're in charge of connecting all the dots. You're in charge of all that, purchasing and, shipping and everything that relates to that. And that's just for customer number 1. Each customer then becomes a project that you need to, manage separately. You need to size it separately, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see that in terms of the image-based software approach, where you just buy the software and you fill in the rest of the blanks, that the software itself is really just the tip of the iceberg. From there, there's a lot of pieces to stitch together to maintain. There's a lot of complexity, therefore a lot more labor. And the reality is, as a service provider especially, most of our technicians are generalists. It's not like life in the big enterprise where your whole job is the backup administrator. In the MSP, the service provider, your backup is one part of your day. You're doing many other things. And then on top of that, with this kind of build your own adventure approach, you're also responsible for the procurement, the patching, the managing any security gaps, and also if you're hosting that offsite storage, you've got that data center cost. So we all know that electricity is cheap these days. No, it's not. And so that that cost of the data center continues to be rising. So in terms of the juxtaposition, when people are moving to a cloud first architecture, usually the biggest statements are along the nature of that cloud first architecture is removing all that work that you see below the surface. It's moving it off the desks of your technicians. And so you can imagine the impact that's having. We got a couple quotes on the screen, but basically the stories are consistent of, more than 3 full-time equivalents to less than 1, 40 hours a month down to 4, 95 tickets a day down to 9. That sort of, transformational impact in terms of all those costs that are below the surface. All right, so let's move to example number 2 here, and let's talk about the integrated appliance. And it really is a different approach. The MSPs will talk about how it's turnkey, sort of, sounds like the easy button of DR. A lot of that complexity that we talked about with the image-based software approach, it's removed. It includes everything you need. Now, sure, you do need to size each customer. You need to do that procurement work. You need to over provision. So just like with an image-based software solution, if you've got a customer with a terabyte of production you need probably a device that's about 2.5 or 3 terabytes to support that with some growth. So each individual customer does need to be signed, but once you're beyond that, it seems to work pretty well. So so that seems like a great deal, and it certainly is a lot of the feedback that we would hear on a regular basis. But let's look at an example of how this really breaks down. So taking an MSP with 30 customers, so some small, let's say 15 small, 10 medium, 5 larger customers, and what does that mean? Well, 4 servers at the small side, 8 servers at the large side. So if we kind of add up that total VMs, we can see across our 30 customers, this MSP is managing 160 servers. So reasonable environment, the size of those servers all very average, kind of 200 to 300 gigs, nothing fancy. Of course, we know there's lots of larger examples out there. And if we look at, after we size them up and we look at the ongoing monthly costs, we can see that across those 160 servers, we'd be spending about just over $17,000. And that's just on the monthly maintenance, like what you're going to pay to the vendor. That's not including the capital cost. So if you want to add on the capital cost to buy those 30 appliances you would need, you're looking at about an additional $68,000 or close to $1,900 per month. If you were to divide that $68,000 per month divided over 36 months, it's $1,900 per month. So you can see then that your fully loaded kind of expense line, if you amortize your capital cost over 36 months, is $19,296 in this example. Or spread that over 3 years, that's $694,000. So if we look back, if we just ignore that for a minute and just look at the 17,400 and divide that by the 160 VMs that we're protecting, we're paying like $108 per VM in that math. And at that point, we're starting to ask the question, if you're paying more for your disaster recovery solution than you are for your actual production environment. And that is just your cost to the vendor, right? So you need to also then amp that up in terms of, building some margin in. So, if we take the fully loaded cost, it's $120 per VM. We want to add, 50% on that, let's say. Now we're up to $180 per VM. And so, pretty soon, we're asking, how practical is this? And then, there's also the question of walking through that practical, like, what am I paying for? Well, it's this ability to fail over to a cloud, which is great, but then there's often the questions of like, how practical is that? How am I going to fail back? And how much of a premium am I willing to pay for something I'm likely to never use? I certainly don't want to. And then lastly, of course, that's just covering off certain workloads. What about our Azure VMs? Those are popping up more frequently. Workstations, Microsoft 365, do we want to use separate products in that way? So the long story short is we can see that the size of the iceberg is actually very similar. It's just that the iceberg has become much more buoyant. The costs that we have, the hard cost of the vendor, with an image-based solution, they look very low, but then there's a lot of cost below the surface. With an integrated appliance, we can see that the price tag is high, but a lot of those costs are taken off our plate because it does kind of work as a turnkey solution. But by way of comparison, if we look at what a cloud first approach would look like, we can see that the cost economics are dramatically different. So comparing $694,000 over 3 years compared to $180,000 over 4 years. So that's a $500,000 difference. And relative to, I guess the point is like, this isn't talking about a 10% savings. This is talking about a dramatically different approach because you don't need to over provision, because you're not shipping hardware, because there's a lot of complexity removed. It means that the underlying economics are just much stronger. I wouldn't say that an integrated appliance vendor would want to charge an egregious price or anything like that. But the fact is that there's a lot of cost in that approach. And so the only way to run a viable business is to maintain prices like that. Whereas this cloud first approach is really disruptive in terms of removing that underlying cost, which can then, of course, then be passed on to yourselves. Now, of course, one of the questions asked is like, well, you're not shipping hardware to me. It's not the same solution. And that's true. Certainly, you can get the same outcome with the use of some hardware. So meaning that, production goes down, you've got an image on the local network, but it does require some infrastructure if that's your requirement for your customer. So, if you want to build out what that looks like across 30 customers, well, the practical examples we've seen, if you wanted to buy brand new Dell hardware and you spent 120 grand on that, so you made essentially that 180,000 you amp that up to $300,000 in your investment, you would be able to have a very, elegant and production grade set of hardware available across those customers. Some MSPs have realized that there is some very good Dell refurbished hardware available for less than probably about 66% less in most cases. So like 40K of Dell refurbished hardware comes with a 3-year warranty. It's stuff that isn't used for production. It's just used for recovery. It's a perfect fit. And that's a very valid approach. Many MSPs have found. Also, the thing to remember within there is that approach is really to serve Robert. And there will still be many Michaels in your customer base, and it's really finding that fits both of them. And so you might not actually be using that full approach with all of your customers, and it's great that you can segment them and price them out appropriately based on that. So ultimately, if you're achieving the same outcomes and as you are today, let's say you're using an integrated appliance, you can get the same outcomes, therefore you can be charging the same prices, but you can lower your cost structures significantly. And so if it's going to go down by 60%, let's say, obviously you can do the math on how that impacts your profitability. And so by laying that all out, kind of the conclusion we can see is it's the icebergs are the same in terms of the approach for an image-based software solution or a purpose-built appliance. But in the case of a cloud-first approach, there really is this aspect of turning that iceberg into an ice cube, reducing that attack surface, reducing that complexity. Just architecturally, you've got this advantage that you removed all the critical attack vectors off the network, reducing the labor and the complexity. So in the sense of, you never need to think about storage, you're only deploying agents, very straightforward and efficient to run. And of course, the cost of the vendor, just because there's these natural advantages of, how the cloud reduces that complexity. And so that cost below the surface relative to the traditional appliances is just a very material amount.